to think about best practice when it comes to coaching and how everybody can get better. So I'm excited to be a part of that. So I will jump into my presentation here. So yeah, just to give a little bit of a context here to the presentation. I mean, we started the company Athlete Era, and we do a lot in the technology space. But first and foremost, I come from a background in football, in sport, in kinesiology, and it's a major passion of mine, as well as a lot of people within our organization. So I really wanted to make sure that this presentation came across as just giving a lot of insightful information. Whether or not you choose to take advantage of the mobile app and some of the other things coming out is up to you, but we're really here to just push sport forward and youth sport as a whole, and football really is a part of that. So just not to go into too much detail, but just a little bit of a quick background on myself from a playing football standpoint. I played post-secondary for 5 years, so 2 years with the Hilltops here in Saskatoon, and then went on to play 3 years with the Huskies. So grew up playing football. It was definitely my sport of choice. And then just from a coaching football context, spent 5 years coaching primarily youth six-a-side football here in Saskatoon with SMF. So I think that's where a lot of the original enjoyment of coaching and a lot of that stuff stemmed from. And then from a working standpoint, before I was with Athlete Era here, Taylor, can you see is that pop-up window blocking the presentation? I'm just not sure.
Nope, I can see it, bud.
Okay, perfect. Yep. Yeah, and then from
you can drag it out of your way if you need.
Okay, perfect. From a working standpoint, I really started in more so the field of strength and conditioning. Working with a lot of youth programs, and that's where I was kind of exposed to a lot of some of the concepts around long-term athlete development and skill development as it pertains to youth sports in a lot of those areas. Did a little bit in the exercise therapy world as well. And then from an actual education background, I did an undergraduate degree in kinesiology with a focus on just general exercise science. Then went back to do my master's specifically in the realm of biomechanics. And then basically where I'm at currently is here with Athlete Era, and really what inspired us to start the business is just to find, I guess, more better ways to utilize technology to just get information into the hands of coaches, and also help coaches communicate that information with whether it be other assistant coaches on the team, parents, players, all those sorts of things. So to get into the workshop a little bit of what I'll be covering today, I'm going to start off with a little bit of science, kind of theory-based stuff, and then get into some applications. So what I really wanted to go through from, I guess, a little bit of a theory standpoint is a little bit of this information about long-term player development models or long-term athlete development models, what they are, where they came from, and then specifically as it kind of pertains to football, how they're really kind of impacting some of the changes you might see coming out in youth football. So I know there's a lot of talks right now of kind of moving towards 9-a-side, 9-man version of the game, 6-a-side. Where does flag football fit in? Like a lot of these conversations going on right now. So the intent was to allow basically provide a little bit more context as to why some of those things actually might be changing. And then most importantly, just from a coaching standpoint, especially at the youth level, what are some key takeaways in terms of how can I incorporate some of this stuff in my coaching practice and how I'm running teams? And that's where we'll really kind of transition into a little bit more of the applied stuff. So just I have a couple slides there on just kind of thinking with the skill first mindset, and really focusing on technical skill development within practices, and then how you can kind of go through the process of maybe taking a look at drills you might be running currently or thinking of running, and then also practice planning in terms of how you can kind of start to think about integrating some of these concepts into your practice routine itself. So to start off with a little bit of the science theory-based stuff, I know some of us might be familiar with long-term player development models. Some of us might not be, but just to provide a little bit of context, it's something that has been going on for quite a while now. And really it started off in 1995, was kind of the first original version that ever came out. And Canada was actually kind of a leader in this front, in terms of devising long-term athlete development and the concept and the models and everything that came with it. And really what it's all about is essentially applying a model for that at each age level of sport. And it's not specific to football, but just making sure we're modifying sport and delivering it in a way that's appropriate for every single age group. And there's obviously a lot of context that go into that, but it's essentially how can we make sport the best experience for every single athlete to make sure they get better, and there's obviously a high performance context, but there's also kind of a large health component to it as well, in terms of making sure people enjoy sports so they continue to engage in it for a long period of time, to see the long-term health benefits that sport can bring to individuals' lives. So a lot of these theories started coming about in 1995. And I'd say 2005 is really the time when a lot of at the national level, a lot of the sport bodies began to actually really kind of embrace the concepts of long-term athlete development, in terms of feeling like there's a lot of good things here that could help the development and further our sport for everybody that's involved in it at all levels. And I would say kind of the one challenge that came with that, as these models have expanded, they've also gotten more complex, and there's a lot more to them. So it's also led to challenges of how do we make sure this is communicated in a way that everybody understands and it makes sense to everybody at multiple levels of sport. So as that was coming about, it's kind of progressed now, and 2009 was really when kind of the first American sports organizations really started to embrace a lot of these concepts, and USA Hockey was kind of a leader in that respect, and the US Olympic Committee in terms of formalizing these models, and really starting to push for organizations to embrace a lot of these concepts. And then in 2015, due to advocacy from a lot of organizations, I just have the Aspen Institute, their Project Play. If you look them up, Google them, they've come out with a lot of really good stuff, and Canadian Sport for Life is kind of their equivalent in Canada. But basically, they started putting together a lot of data and information in terms of why it's important for kids to play sport and keep playing sport, and basically how we can improve the environment as a whole of youth sport to make sure it is an enjoyable experience, and it can also maximize kind of like the high performance potential within all sports. And 2015 was kind of an interesting time because I mean, there's a lot of events going on in sport. Like every sport kind of has its own specific driver with a lot of these shifts. Like for football, obviously, the main topic of discussion is concussions and a lot of that stuff that's kind of been a hot topic and driving a major focus on athlete safety and all these things. But there's been other sports that have gone through a lot of other things. But basically what it all resulted in was a lot more, I guess, sense of urgency from a national sport perspective to kind of adopt and really start to implement these models. And that's where we've now seen kind of since that time point up until the present, organizations like Football Canada kind of moving forward with more requirements in terms of making some changes to the game at the youth level. And now Football USA is pretty on board, and I'll talk a little bit about their stuff. But that's just a little bit of where they've come from and where they're going. And I just have two quick videos I'm going to show here that can kind of explain it a little bit better than I can. So the first one is the football development model from USA Football, and this is one thing that our organization is working with them on as well. Is basically when they roll out the FDM, which they're doing right now, there's a ton of information with it, and a lot of stuff that goes into making sure it's delivered properly. So we're basically making sure that from a mobile app perspective that people can use smartphones to essentially access this information in a way that's efficient and easy for them to use on field. But they have a really great video that they put together just describing what the FDM is and kind of what long-term athlete development means in the context of football.
What was a scrum became a snap. Kicking and batting gave way to the run game. Downs and distance provided structure, and a gridiron was drawn. Blocking was born, and then passing truly moved the game forward. Each evolution has advanced football, improving the sport at each step. This is what's next.
So the football development model is America's way of rolling out what we call long-term athlete development for every child who participates in sport. You're doing what's appropriate for your level of development, physically, mentally, socially.
You take youth football, but then you fast forward 20 years. What that guy's going to remember 20 years after youth football are moments. What we want on our level in particular is for these young people to have positive football experiences so they keep playing and keep getting better. You know, we want to make sure that our youth are learning to play the game the best way possible. So no different than any other field, you want a part whole teaching progression.
How can we introduce this sport in a way that makes sense for where this child is, and how can we provide a pathway?
As an NFL coach, it's important to me to grow the game. The new football development model that takes you from, learning to play catch, learning some basic fundamentals, to playing in a flag, to that middle step of where you have controlled environment, now contact's introduced. I think it's a natural progression, and it's why I really want to be a part of it in the future.
It all goes back to teaching the foundations the right way, the fundamentals, the techniques, and then when you learn it the right way from that starting point, then it enables you to be able to grow and inevitably become the best version of yourself.
You have to teach the core fundamentals of how you play football. And I think when you can do that, it allows some kids to learn the game of football rather than to stand on the sideline and say, well, I'm a little bit intimidated.
We've got to do it with fundamentals first, and a progression model gives us an opportunity to do that.
You really have this core foundation of fun and athleticism. Then you incrementally build skills, a holistic vision of how to reimagine football. That's where USA Football, I believe, is going to make a difference.
Innovation makes our game stronger both today and tomorrow. This is the future of football.
So that's just a bit of a video kind of describing, I guess, athlete development in a context really specific to football. One thing about the U.S. sports organizations is they're great at marketing and putting together stuff and engaging things like that, which is why I decided to show that video. But you heard a lot of common concepts kind of emphasized there of just making sure the game's age appropriate, making sure we're emphasizing skill development so that athletes can continue to progress and get better at every single stage as they move through the sport. And one video, I'm not going to show it right now, but there's a USA Hockey one that's great too. USA Hockey has some good ones, but just to put it in a context, they have a video where they basically took an ice surface rink and said, if you made this, scaled it up to adult size in terms of making this rink and the nets and everything with it, the same size as it is for kids, would it be as enjoyable of an experience? And they have hockey nets that are like 10 feet tall and those sorts of things. So it just puts it into a little bit more context, why it is important to understand kind of modified versions of the game and equipment and smaller fields, and how those can lead to an improved experience for kids that are engaged in the sport. So key changes at the youth level. I already touched on a couple of these, but this is where it starts to kind of apply. But this is what's stemming from a lot of this, or what's really causing this move to explore playing on smaller surfaces, concepts of small-sided games where you have less players. So like 6-a-side football, for instance. And then another one too is a little bit of a development first mindset. So making sure that there's a little bit of a prescribed ratio of practices to games and those sorts of things. And then I'm sure a lot of the other things we've heard about is the emphasis on multi-sport participation and allowing kids to play multiple games. And then the big one that it's really changed to is a little bit more of an athlete-centered approach to kind of program quality at the youth level, and really making sure that participant retention is something that a lot of organizations are starting to pay attention to. So at the end of the day, like we've talked to a lot of league administrators and people that kind of say it best is the kids will continue to come back year over year if they had a fun and enjoyable experience. And I think that's an important thing. It's just making sure people are a little bit more focused that, yes, we want participation numbers up. The more people participating in football, the better, but also making sure, are we maintaining those numbers because kids are coming back, or are kids leaving the sport and then we're just filling those participation numbers with new kids that have never played. So just having a little bit more focus on that as well. And then these are just applying them to, so football specifically, I kind of just already touched on this, but some of the concepts stemming from this are making sure we have age-appropriate game types, and this is with some of the Football Canada stuff coming forward as well, of just progressing kids from 6-a-side football at the younger age groups up to 9-a-side, and then up to full 12-a-side versions of the game once you're at the high school level, and just allowing that to basically have the kids explore different positions, more time touching the ball, more time focused on skill development, all those various good things that can come with it. And then from the development first standpoint, I'm not sure exactly how many leagues in Alberta at the youth level run this way, but I know quite a few of them in Saskatchewan have kind of introduced the concepts of standardized playbooks. So just when we're running leagues, it's preset plays. And I think one thing that's really meant to emphasize is just that there's nothing wrong with competition and playing games, and all that stuff is great. It's just making sure that the context is that you're not kind of having that winning at all costs type mentality within the youth environment, but also when you kind of add in some just kind of preset playbooks, that sort of stuff, then it allows coaches to kind of really focus on winning through, I guess you could say, superior execution when it comes to actually running plays and technical skill performance, rather than winning through kind of finding the best strategy and scheme from a play standpoint to exploit the weaknesses of the other team. And And then the athlete-centered approach is just really a main focus on making sure that it's a great experience for every single player. And obviously you'll have players that enjoy different components of the game, but I guess it's just a matter of being cognizant of that and making sure that when you're delivering practices and doing those things, they're done in a way that make a practice in an ideal world almost as engaging as and fun as a game you might play, where you kind of don't have necessarily that mindset of all the kids are just waiting to get to the game day, because that's the most enjoyable part, but also making sure how can we add a level of competition and a little bit more variety in terms of drills and activities that we do during practice, so that it can get to be an equally enjoyable experience in comparison to games. And then to focus in on that, I really wanted to make sure that we got towards some stuff that was more so tangible takeaways from a coaching standpoint. So, I mean, as a youth football league coach, like when I was coaching in Saskatoon minor football, of course, you don't have control of some things in terms of playbooks and schedules and what game type you're playing. Like a lot of that isn't necessarily in your control, but from the coach's standpoint, the one thing that's really happening is, as I kind of alluded to, it's really pushing organizations to spend a little bit more time in the practice mindset and not quite as much time playing games. So that's really, I think, in a lot of ways, empowering coaches to be like, you control the practice environment for your own team, and you really have a lot of ability to apply a lot of these concepts and really impact all of your athletes in a positive way, from a high performance standpoint as well, just in how you kind of approach the practice planning mindset and drill selection and some of those other things that we'll touch on right away here. So from a practice planning standpoint, again, what you really choose to focus on each week and how you go about designing that practice plan and how you make the most out of your time on the field. All of those things can have a tremendous impact and are really kind of at the core of making some of this transition towards age appropriate sport and delivering a lot of the concepts within these long-term player development models. And then obviously within that practice planning, the drill selection is something that is a major component. And I know it's something that a lot of times, I know even when I was coaching, sometimes you didn't spend as much time really thinking in detail about drills. A lot of the times it's kind of the mindset of you have your 5 or 10 drills that you like and you've been running and they're going well and you're familiar with them. But I think a lot of this is kind of coming back to like, how can I really go into those drills that I use and take them to another level in terms of adding variations and switching them up and adding competition rules and all those sorts of things to keep players engaged within those specific drills during your practices is also a massive component. And then just from the practice environment as well, as youth coaches, and I'm sure there's some high school coaches as well, but you kind of set that practice environment by really deciding what to emphasize with your players and what's important when it comes to a practice standpoint, but just helping kind of create some of that mindset that yes, I know the biggest thing I dealt with was that in the youth level in Saskatoon minor football in their 6-a-side league, they don't keep score, so they don't keep scores any of the games, and all the players always come up like, coach, are we winning? Like, what's the score? Like, what's that? And it's really, the players are competitive and they want to win, and again, like I said, that's fine, but it's also just kind of harnessing that and then making sure they're focusing some of that on the right things of during practice and or if you're scrimmaging and just being like, you can emphasize other things like how many passing plays were we able to actually complete in a row and move forward, instead of emphasizing necessarily the score and the outcomes of the game. So you really control a lot of that mindset and that environment within the practice. So now we're just going to dive into a couple of application things, and this is where I'll kind of refer to the mobile app a little bit, but mostly in the context. I don't know if anybody's been into the mobile app at all that we've developed in collaboration with Football Canada, but essentially when you get down to the level of finding a drill, so there's a drill library, you can go in there's a whole bunch of different drills. But once you get into that drill library, you have basically a diagram or a video to quickly show how that drill is actually performed. And then there's really 3 key elements that we've associated with each drill. So one being the description, which is pretty straightforward. What do I do if I'm running any sort of drill, whether it's a passing wheel or a progression to run routes, all those sorts of things. But then the other 2 components are basically the coaching points and the variations. And the reason that we have it that way, and the content will continue to kind of grow and improve in those areas, is a lot of times those coaching points really just make you think in terms of like, what is the main purpose that we're really trying to emphasize from a skill acquisition standpoint within this drill. And then those variations are really meant to be quick ways of how can I quickly switch up some rules surrounding a drill for how it can be performed, to make sure everybody that can do it in a progressive manner. So I'm just really going to get into a little bit of kind of some of the information regarding why we chose those and how you can actually add content within there. And I know right now that the early access version, it's not editable, but those are things that we are adding to the mobile app in the future. Really the main premise is for all the content you see in there currently to kind of use that as building blocks to then speed up the process when it comes to designing your own plan or adding your own variations or coaching points to a drill, so that you can do that quickly with the help of those content building blocks, and you're not having to sit down and create everything from scratch. So one thing I'll touch on is just basically a lot of people might be wondering why is emphasizing the fundamentals of the game such a critical component at the youth level? And a couple key reasons why that is when you think of the movement skills and all the fundamentals of football, they're the one thing that's really transferable and stays with that athlete everywhere they go. So when athletes kind of move through their progression of starting kind of 8 or 9 years old in a tackle league all the way up to high school, to if they have the ability to go on and play post-secondary, if they learn really good skill fundamentals, those are things that are going to stick with them as they move forward. Because I know, as we can attest to, and I can attest to with some coaching and playing experiences, the schemes, the strategy, all those sorts of things, they vary a little bit from coach to coach, to team, where you go forward. So if you get a lot of time at the younger levels spent on that sort of stuff, kind of in order to end, and you sacrifice the time spent on learning those fundamentals, then that strategy stuff may not transfer and may not set that athlete up for the best chance to be successful at the next level, because some of those schemes and strategies may change over time. Another one too here, and I kind of touched on this a little bit, is basically as football gets more competitive and you kind of progress, you progress up to high school and post-secondary, you obviously can't be doing things like just saying, hey, we're gonna add a new rule to the game in terms of how it's played at this level, that's just not a realistic situation once you're in more competitive leagues. Whereas at the youth level, and especially in the practice environment, if you can basically modify rules and really put an emphasis on developing skills, because there's not as many people that are necessarily as invested in making sure that you have a winning team like there is kind of once you start to get to the older aspects. And then another one we touched on too, and this is more so in a long-term athlete development context, but basically the more skilled kids are, a lot of times the more success they actually have with the game, which leads to further enjoyment, which is a huge component in terms of making sure that they keep on coming back and playing the sport each year. So when you put that a little bit more emphasis on a skill development from that context, it really is, it's beneficial for athletes, both from a long-term high performance standpoint as well as just a general health perspective. And that's why there's a lot of emphasis placed on it. So one thing to clarify before we get into kind of breaking down some of these drills and plans with a focus on skill development is just, I know based on my background, when I'm talking about skill development, I'm really talking about the movement skills themselves. So we're not really talking about the skills of being able to read what direction a running back is going and reacting in that way. We're really talking specifically about developing technical movement skills. So kind of the motor learning view when you're talking about a skill is just a particular ability in which you can develop proficiency. I myself am a little bit more coming from a biomechanics background, more of a numbers guy. So I also kind of like the force production, force transfer approach to movement. Basically, when you think of the context of performance in sport, everything can kind of be summarized around those two variables. So it's your body's ability to produce force, whether that's throwing a football, tackling someone, running a route, changing direction, and then the force transfer context in terms of once you've completed that movement is the goal to transfer that force to a ball, to travel to a particular target or distance, or all those other variables that are contained within it. So we're basically referring to those really fundamental movements of the sport. So you think of throwing in the context, it's throwing, which would just kind of be the general skill, throwing a football, and then it gets a little bit more specific as you break that down in terms of if I was throwing a hook route or a fly route, those are going to be slightly different versions of the same movement skill. So they kind of follow this continuum flow of going from general skills down to the more specific versions. And typically as you progress as an athlete and as you progress kind of through your levels and age groups of football, a lot of times the emphasis is placed on making sure you learn the more general versions of the skill before you get too specific, because if you start at the most specific version, it's usually requires more motor control. So it's a little bit more difficult to actually learn the fundamentals of that skill if you're starting an athlete at too specific of a version, and you might have to regress to a more simple version of that skill until they have success with it, and then you can challenge them by introducing the more refined movements. So taking that into consideration from the movement skill standpoint, now what we're going to do is just, I guess, thinking through a lens of a real focus on movement skills, just kind of how you could go through and kind of critique maybe some drills that you've been using for a long time, critique some new drills you found from other coaches, all those sorts of things, and even critique the drills you find within the mobile app. I know we're more so the software side of things, but we're also always working with organizations to make sure that the content that they're putting in there is complete and follows a lot of those things. But when it comes to developing drills and trying to make them a really good environment to develop technical skills, it's a little bit of a balancing act between making sure each drill has a specific focus in terms of what technical skill you're actually trying to develop within your players when you're running that drill, but also making sure that it's done in a way that has some progression to it, that makes it easy to modify and switch, and basically make sure that as players get better at the skills that you're doing, that you can add and make it more difficult without having to completely change the drill itself. From a skill focus standpoint, I also don't want to make sure I'm painting the perception of that kids should just be throwing like doing partner pass for 20 minutes every single practice, because that might be a high level of skill focus on throwing, and you're getting a lot of time devoted to that task. But as everybody knows that works with younger players, that gets boring pretty fast, and you're gonna lose those kids being engaged. So you have to find this balance of making sure you're not overly skill focused, but then also at the same time making sure you're not building out drills that are very complex, and then you kind of step back and look at it and be, I know a lot of times when we're kind of going through content and some of the mindsets are just, you see a drill and it's like, oh, what skills are being developed in this drill? And if there's a lot of components to it, you might say, oh, we're developing how to give a handoff, how to receive a handoff, learning jump cuts and all these sorts of things. And you might find how that drill was delivered. It's, yeah, each player within the drill might get 1 or 2 reps with each skill, but was it really focused in that? Can you say at the completion of that drill, everybody got better at one particular skill? You might not be exactly sure. So you're kind of trying to balance those things when it comes to looking at drills and making sure they're designed in a way to really develop technical skills. So one thing I'm just going to go through now is a little bit of a drill review checklist in terms of some of the things you might be able to look at when you're kind of going through some of the drills you might be using with more focus. So one thing I just talked about previously, and this is a really important component, especially in the research, it's fairly definitive that the more time you spend on task, in terms of the more number of quality reps you do focusing on a specific skill, the more automatic that'll become. And that's what allows you to basically transfer that and perform that skill at a high level in a game environment. So there's a pretty distinct relationship in terms of the amount of time you spend from a rep standpoint and actually practicing a skill to being able to acquire that skill and now move on and add more complexity to how you would actually perform that skill in more of a game environment. So I know this is a big one that really stood out for me when you kind of look at, you might be looking at a drill, and a drill from a skill focus standpoint, when you put it in that narrative, one drill could be a fantastic drill if the skill focus is on the right thing. Whereas if you say the skill focus of a specific drill, which one should I use for example? Like passing wheel, if you like a simple passing wheel where you have 2 quarterbacks set up and receivers running routes, if you said the specific focus of that drill was develop throwing technique, well, that's a great drill. But if there's only 2 people that end up throwing the ball for 10 minutes, then those are the only 2 that develop that skill. So it's okay at the higher levels once you have kind of everybody focused on kind of like position specific skill development, but at the youth level where you kind of want a little bit more exposure to a variety of skills, then that might not be the best choice of a drill if that is your specific skill focus. And then another one to take into consideration as well, and this is a little bit more geared towards newer coaches, I guess, once you're getting involved, is just it's definitely a learning curve when you're working with players at the younger level. But one thing to sit back and kind of look at as well, if you're trying a new drill, is just how long will it actually take to explain this drill in terms of what's the complexity. Because again, this all relates back to, if you want to maximize your time on task and being able to get as many quality reps in as possible, if the drill is too complicated and it can't be explained in 30 seconds or less, and it has a lot of rules associated with it, then you might end up spending kind of more time in your practice actually just explaining drills than the kids are actually working on the specific drills and getting those quality reps in. So just being cognizant of how many rules are involved in the drill, and if you have more complex drills that take a little bit longer to explain, that's fine, but maybe just think about it in a way of, how could I break this down into like, what are the 3 or 4 rules that everybody needs to know in order to just do this drill, and can we start there? And once everybody has got some reps in and they grasp that, now how can we kind of add in rules over time? And that might be within the same practice, that might be during the next practice, the next week, but then at least you can make sure that you're getting a lot of time on task when you're doing these drills. And then this is a major one as well, drill modifications. So basically making sure that there's a level of challenge for every level of ability. And if I'm doing a drill, can I make sure that the drill can be done in such a way that I can add in some new variations or new aspects to the drill to make sure it stays challenging for everybody involved, without causing me to completely basically switch gears a little bit and introduce an entire new drill within the practice, because then you're kind of going back to the thing that I said before. Now, if you have to bring in a whole new drill, now it's going to be a lot more explaining, a lot more standing around, and can kind of slow down the tempo of your practice a little bit. So some of these drill tune-ups, this is kind of what I touched on, of basically some kind of ideas that you may be able to use when you go through your drills in terms of common concepts within this area. But definitely minimizing lineups is a big one. So that's why I just use this little drill video as an example. It could really be the same drill, but just how you deliver it can really make all the difference. Find the whole drill there, you just have basically running back, receiving a handoff, and then running through a specific hole. So kind of a good drill in the context of football to teach proper technique for receiving a handoff, ball carrying, and then you have finding the hole to add a little bit of football context. But just even setting up drills like this, where you have 2 lines of athletes going, athlete ends and then joins the line on the other side, rather than setting up essentially half of this drill where you'd have a larger line, you'd have double the kids on one line, and then you're getting a lot less time on task. So a lot of times just how you set up a drill in that context can help really improve the number of reps all the kids are getting, and develop the skills to go along with that. Another thing as well is, as a coach, and once you kind of have that focus, making sure you're prepared and you have a couple of those other drills in your back pocket of, hey, what if we get to this drill and a lot of the kids can't even, they're not even demonstrating the proper arm position when receiving a handoff. Like, what do we do then? Is this maybe not the best starting point for them because there's other things involved in the drill, but just basically having some of those ideas in your back pocket of can we go through and basically switch the drill up completely quickly if it's necessary. And this other one I already touched on, and I'll go into it a little bit more, but basically how can we vary the drill environment? And a good one example, even just in this little diagram, is basically coaches calling out the number for what hole the player is actually supposed to go to. So just to give an example of a little modification to this in terms of how it could make the drill more or less difficult is basically if you call out the number beforehand and the athlete already knows where they're going, now they can focus a little bit more on the actual technique of receiving the handoff and protecting the ball and running with it versus introducing a variation where that coach calls out the hole after the athlete has actually received the number. Really kind of changes the context of the drill because now that player is a lot more focused on where do I go and how do I react to the environment around me versus how do I actually just position my arms properly to receive the handoff. So that's just an example of kind of how you could tweak the environment a little bit where if everybody's demonstrating the good technique of receiving a handoff, then great, call the number out afterwards so you can make the drill a little bit more difficult and kind of change the intent. But if you start with that variation and you see instantly now a lot of the kids aren't even demonstrating proper arm position when they're receiving a handoff, then that's probably a good indication that that skill kind of hasn't reached that level where it's just automatic from a motor learning standpoint. So you might have added in a variation that's a little bit too complex based on where the kid's current abilities are at. And these are just some examples of other ways to modify drills and the environment. Speed is a big one. That's one that's very familiar for a lot of us is if the kids are having a challenging time, there's nothing wrong with slowing down the drill until they can get it right and then progressing the speed after that and seeing if they can maintain the technique. Modifying directions is a big one, just making sure that kids are comfortable performing the skill and they don't have an immediate preference that they then tend to favor when doing it over time. And then another one is basically for this drill, for instance, is adding skills together or linking them once they've actually been learned in isolation. So for this one, if your initial focus when you start could be receiving the handoff, but if everyone's mastered that and they're doing it well, maybe then we can switch it up and do some of those things like I talked about before where we're going to add in the handoff, and then once they secure the ball and they make a cut, they're going to have to switch the ball into the opposing arm. And you can kind of see if can they do all these skills in succession without technique kind of falling off. Changing the environment's a big one. Honestly, I know I'm going through this quite quickly and there's a lot of different things. After I was putting the presentation together, I said I should have just picked drills or plans because there's not enough time to do both. But environment is basically one of the main ones is that example I just gave in the previous slide of adding in a number or basically changing the external environment so the athlete has to react or perform the skill in a certain way based on something that's going on external to them. So that's a great way to progress drills. It's just making sure that you do that after the skill is being demonstrated properly multiple times in a row. And then another good one too is introduction of competition. But again, this is one to be used once kids are actually demonstrating a skill properly. Now this is a good way if you want to introduce competition in the form of kids in other lines racing each other or relay races or how many times can you do this specific skill without dropping the ball or various ways to allow the kids to make the drill a little bit more engaging through introduction of competition. So now I'm just going to touch a little bit on practice planning. I know we got about 5 minutes left here. But practice planning now kind of comes into a little bit of a unique area, because I know everyone's probably sitting there and saying it's great if you have all day and a ton of time to design the optimal drills and all this stuff. That's great, but practice planning is really now, okay, how do we balance this kind of optimal coaching theory with the reality of my current circumstances? And I know especially at the youth level, there's going to be a lot of things that you're dealing with, that you're going to have to work around and make sure that you can deliver a practice in the best way possible that works in your environment. So now you're kind of starting to take into consideration, like, that's great that you want to maximize time on task, and I want to do a specific drill where everybody's focusing on something that requires the football, or might require bags or hand shields or all those sorts of things, but I might not have enough equipment to allow everybody to be doing that. So there's that you have to consider. And then obviously the time constraints of how long you actually have to prepare and communicate all this stuff with others. And that's really one of the things we're trying to support within the mobile app, is just if we give coaches more efficient ways to really plan very detailed plans and drills and save things that work for you, and kind of facilitate the communication of that, whether it be to players at home or to parents that are helping you coach, or to other assistant coaches, then how can we basically make a lot of these things more achievable in a real world environment at the youth level. And then obviously team size and coaching staff is a massive one as well. I mean, it would be great if every single youth football team had a large number of assistant coaches, to the extent that they could implement a lot of this stuff. But sometimes that's just not the reality. So how do you kind of make the best use of that? And after kind of going through these things, you can see, I mean, a lot of them, there's not easy answers. And this is where you could spend an entire session on kind of how do you practice plan based on various constraints. But just for a couple little things to add in kind of this skill context when it comes to practice planning, implementing circuits in your practice is one thing that has really kind of, I would say, set itself forward as kind of the new gold standard for practice plan delivery at the youth level. And it's kind of interesting in the football context, because a lot of football coaches, when you have position groups, you're really implementing essentially kind of a circuit-based format within your practices already, where you're grouping up athletes and everybody's doing a drill with one coach and maybe 7 to 10 players, which is great from a circuit format, because obviously once you have those smaller group size, you can get a lot more dedicated time on the actual skill you're trying to develop, and more coaching, all that sort of stuff. I think one thing from a football standpoint that it just changes the context a little bit is making sure that at the youth level especially, that kids are given the opportunity to kind of explore skills that would be required of a variety of position groups. So you're not necessarily only doing passing and catching and route running because you've been put in the receiver group, but recognizing that kids are going to grow and mature at different rates. So the kids that are smaller right now, and you might say, hey, you're best suited for this position, that might not always be the case. So allowing them to kind of rotate around within the practice and get exposure to different skills is also an important concept. Another big one too would be just considering the time allocation to kind of, especially as football coaches, putting how much time do we put during kind of that individual skills, or really that like technical skills time within our practice versus time devoted to offense defense periods, and just kind of at the younger age groups, how that time should be a little bit more heavily weighted towards the individual skills, because then we have more time to develop them, versus as the kids get older and more mature and more advanced in terms of how they can do all these skills. Now we can spend a little bit more time on more offense, defense, team time, all those sorts of things, where you can actually now start linking those skills together in their full form, whether it be practicing passing plays, running plays, and the various other things that come with it. And the major one too, and this, there's no easy answer for this one. I think in the youth sport context as well, the biggest challenge that we face is when kids come in or kids join your team, they sign up, you never know exactly where that kid is in a lot of contexts in terms of how they can perform all the various skills. So a lot of times what happens is you have kids with a very large range of abilities in terms of how they can do things. So really what it comes down to is, if you're running circuits, it's how are you grouping up those kids? Are you kind of putting a little bit of thought into how can we group kids based on their ability levels, given what I plan to focus practice on today, so that I make sure that when those kids kind of travel through those circuits, the coaches can be prepared in terms of, they already know they're going to get kind of one group who can do this drill super well, so you can focus more on the complex variations, whereas you might get another group where this skill is pretty new to them, so you might have to run the more simplified version of that drill. But I mean, the beauty is when you rotate the kids around a lot of times in that circuit format, they might not necessarily, because the drill kind of looks the same, seems the same initially, they won't initially pick up on that in terms of trying not to isolate the kids and saying that you're doing a more simplified version because other kids are more advanced. Yeah, that's about all my time. So I know I covered a lot there, but I definitely encourage everybody to get in, check out the app. But that was just a little bit more information around kind of some of the thought process that goes behind putting together some of those content building blocks, and hopefully how you can kind of take some of that and apply it to your own coaching practice at the youth and potentially the high school level.
All right, thank you very much, Corey. Anybody have any questions or comments? Feel free to type it into the chat bar here, or turn your video on and join. Corey, how has the what's the word I'm looking for? But like downloads, and how has the interest been in the app the last couple of weeks since it's been live?
It's been pretty solid. I know in the Canadian version, we've just in the last 2 weeks had a little over 250 coaches in there, and then the version that's quite similar for USA football, that one we just launched. When did they? I mean, USA football is just a different beast from a promotional standpoint.
Yeah.
But I mean, that one they started promoting just this week, and I think we're already up to 1,500 coaches into that one just in the first couple of days. So,
well, what can you do here? I'm going to put you on the spot, but like to open it up now, or to show us some of the pages, or at least get us to the landing page. Maybe their coaches can explore it and sign up. And so, if anybody doesn't know, while maybe Corey's looking it up, it's footballcanadamobile.com.
Yeah, footballcanadamobile.com.
And you can go and check it out. It's free until maybe the end of quarantine. I'm not sure the exact date, maybe June 30th, but check it out. It has some great resources in there, and maybe Corey can just summarize exactly what's in it. I know you've talked about it here and there, but what all options are in there? There's a lot of different features that they can do, not just drills.
Yeah, for sure. So the primary features are basically the drill library, like I talked about, and everything's kind of broken down into specific skill categories, and then the focus. So kind of what I went into of the more detailed skills, and all the drills have the detailed breakdowns. And then also on there is there's some pre-designed practice plans. So basically completed practice plans, and everything is filtered based on the specific type of football that you're running and the age group, so we can make sure that it's a little bit more specific to your needs. And then we also have a couple scheduling and communication tools as well. So basically when coaches jump into the app, you can create your team, and you get a team code that you can share with parents and players to basically have them join up with your team in the app. And once you've made your team, that's what allows you to do some of the basic communication tools. So you can schedule practices or other activities. And when you schedule it in the app, everybody on your team gets a push notification, so they see when and where that event's taking place, and they can RSVP to let the coach know whether or not they're going to be there. And then also with that scheduling thing, that's where we're building out a lot of the content sharing tools. So if you create a practice and then you're using a plan within the app, you can basically assign that plan to that specific event. And now everybody on your team, whether it be parents, players, or assistant coaches, can jump in there and see the completed plan with all the detailed practice plan breakdowns. And that's the area, especially at the youth level, we think we can provide a lot of value of just being like, if some of my assistant coaches and everybody was like super well informed on how each drill can be run and progressed and varied and all these things, then that would make for an amazing practice experience. But if the requirement of the coach is to go into that much detail and describe every drill from scratch, I can tell you that's super time consuming. So the more efficient we can make it for coaches to communicate in detail to everybody what's happening on the field during practice, we feel like the better experience we can support coaches in providing for all the players.
Sure. Explain a little bit about, I think Aaron said it from Football Canada. It said it's really heavy in U14 drills and a lot of great stuff for the really young group. We have a lot of high school coaches on the call. Explain, maybe you had said that they can be importing their own drills and stuff like that. Like, I know it's building every day and it's getting bigger and bigger, but how can we get a little bit more high school drills, and how can our guys help to import some of their drills?
Yeah, for sure. So those are the newer things that are coming for the updated version. Like, it's the early access one, but basically the two customization options that we're looking at for the more experienced coaches are ways that you can basically build your own practice plan out from just using a lot of the drills found within the drill library. And then from a drill context is, like I said, being able to basically grab and take one of the drills that's in there, but being like, I want to add in my own variations and some of my own coaching points for what I really want my players to focus on, and those sorts of things, so that you can customize it to meet your own needs. And then we are looking at other tools where coaches can, if they feel like there's the need to completely put drills in there from scratch, then find other ways to do that. But basically our hopes are to build out the content library to be robust enough that everybody feels like their needs are being met by just kind of grabbing some of the drills that are in there and customizing them to meet their needs.
Perfect. And what was the date? You said this early launch, and kind of what's the timeline moving forward in terms of free, and when you might have a second edition ready?
Yeah, second edition is going to be out at the end of June. So basically we're running with a free early access version for the next 2 months, and then we'll move it up from there. But yeah, we're looking at a few variations within the model to make sure there's kind of abilities to engage at different levels with the app, whether it be a free version, an upgraded paid version, those sorts of things that will work with everybody to roll out.
Perfect. And Kelly had a question there, and what the rate is. At this point, we're still kind of negotiating and figuring that out on our end with our board of directors, but we're looking at roughly Football Alberta buying a bulk buy essentially, and roughly $25 a coach for a year. And that essentially gives you 10 athletes, right? Is that kind of how it works? So we still kind of on that thought. So we don't know the exact when it rolls out in July, what the exact cost will be and what we subsidize and what, but it's regularly $40 if you just buy it. And we're going to buy bulk at around 25. Is that fair, Corey?
Yeah, that is correct. And I mean, we want to make sure that obviously I know people have heard feedback on some of the technology tools becoming a little bit pricey in terms of they've kind of priced themselves out of what's realistic at like the youth and high school level, because obviously what university and college programs and coaches want to pay for and afford is a little bit of a different context. But yeah, we're gonna make sure we keep it in that range between $25 to $40 a coach for annual access.
And you break that down based on 10 players, and it's $2.50 a player. You throw that in the registration, whatever, however we do it. So we'll have more information on that, Kelly, but great questions. So unless there's any other questions, we're going to say goodnight and hopefully see most of you guys tomorrow. We have a gentleman from Huddle from Boston who's going to be chatting about using Huddle beyond the basics. So I know a lot of us live in Huddle during the season. We want to learn how to use it better to our advantages because there is so much more than just the basics. So there's a question here. So far, I downloaded the mobile app, created a personal profile. What do I do next?
Yeah, within it, basically you have to hit the create team button there, and basically once you set up a basic team, then that's what brings you into all the main features of the app.
Yeah. So I guess if that answers your question, Mike, it was a private text. It looked like so. You have to create a team. You can create a team, and then it looks from there. You can build your team out. You can invite other members. You can start building out your practice plans. There's some good football at home opportunities where you could be sending drills as well, right? So talk about quickly about football at home, and then we'll say goodnight.
Yeah, basically those are kind of some pre-designed home-based plans that we're putting in terms of just kind of hand-picking a couple drills that realistically, if kids and their parents are engaged, what can be done in your backyard with a football, some cones, and two people for a chance to kind of have coaches get their teams onto the app, and then through scheduling home-based practices, be able to push that content out to the players to do at home.
Good. So footballcanadamobile.com. Thank you. You'll share this presentation if you don't mind, PDF it and email it over to me. I'll share it with everybody. And I recorded this as well, and I'll also share that link with you yourself, Corey, and everybody else.
Perfect. That sounds good. Thanks a lot.
Have a great night.
Time.
Thanks, Nick.
Bye.